I just wanted to quickly acknowledge where I'm at. I'm in Halifax, and that's on the ancestral unceded territory of the Mi'kma'ki. And I wanted to recognize that fact before we get started today. So we all have rights and responsibilities as settlers and the Mi'kmaq alike, and I think it's important to recognize that before we start. All right, so our first poll of the session. How have you been impacted by COVID? Maybe you haven't, but if you have, you can choose all that apply. So a lot of people are working from home and the primary caregiver for their children or family members. More than half of us are worried about our mental health or that of friends and family, but also access to childcare is limited. Yep, I think that resonates with a lot of the stories that I'm hearing. All right, our next poll. COVID impacts women, men, and gender diverse people equally. Do we disagree, agree, not sure, don't want to answer? Some of us think, so 27% of us think that COVID impacts men, women, and gender diverse people equally. 55% disagree. A few of us, 18%, aren't sure, and no one didn't want to answer. Okay, so I guess we'll get into what that might look like. So the research says, the statistics say that COVID does not, in fact, treat people equally, and that it magnifies the existing inequalities and barriers that they're already facing and may make them worse. So for women and gender diverse people, what that looks like might be an increased risk of contracting COVID. It might mean higher rates of unemployment. It, at least from our polls here and what Statistics Canada says, it might mean an increased burden of caregiving, not just for children, but for people that we love, like our elderly parents. And it means that we might fear violence or experience violence in our home. So that could be domestic violence or gender-based violence. And just a little snapshot. So across Canada, about 55% of the cases of COVID are with women. But in Nova Scotia, where I am, it's 62%. So it's not treating folks equally. When it comes to COVID and the labor market, gender is absolutely a factor, and there are disproportionate effects on women at this time. So since March, 1.5 million women have lost their jobs, and their rate of unemployment is higher. It was worse in March and April, but it seems to be stabilizing a little bit this month. And if you're a young woman between the ages of 15 and 24, you're even more likely to have experienced job loss. So a 38% fall in employment for young women. So it's pretty significant.
We do have an exception in the rule, Caroline. In the chat, I see S. Morrison, I'm sorry I don't know your first name, that actually things improved for this person, and now better connected with friends because they were working from home for 5 years.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah. Nice.
So I guess that's the resilience piece, thriving in a new environment. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the negative stuff, but then we'll move into reframing what this might look like. So that will be the latter portion of the conversation. So if you are a worker that is experiencing vulnerability, COVID is amplifying that or making it worse, right? So if you have different intersections, so of say gender and race and immigration status, your access to stable jobs and employment is going to look different than for others. So job losses are being experienced by many people, but some of the aspects of this that are gendered are temporary and low paid jobs that women are often in, say in caregiving, and with temporary foreign workers, non-unionized positions, service sector workers, that's primarily women, caring professions, and across the board, recent immigrants are also experiencing really negative impacts, and youth, as I mentioned before. But when we think about the future, there are certain sectors, again, that are also gendered. So construction, predominantly male, retail, predominantly female. And these will have different experiences in terms of physical distancing as the economy opens up. So those are things to consider for sure. We also know from Statistics Canada that domestic violence has been an issue. There have been a lot of media attention on this, as well as funding opened up for different organizations that are serving women in this area. 1 in 10 women report they're concerned about the possibility of violence in their home. And that's even more acute for young women between the ages of 15 to 24. You know, the last piece of the statistics is or the consideration for how women are being further marginalized by COVID is around caregiving, right? So care is an essential but really undervalued aspect of our society. We see that it's really the glue that holds everything together. Without access to childcare and care, our economy doesn't run the same way, right? So because of the way that our society is built in terms of different social and cultural norms, women are predominantly responsible for unpaid caregiving, not exclusively. Therefore, they need access to childcare, for example, to be able to work. Also, consideration for lack of access to childcare for essential workers like transit operators and people that can't work from home, and the burden that that's putting on them, not only financially, but in terms of their mental health, might be exacerbating other problems within the home, like domestic violence. These stats speak to an opportunity. So they're, you know, disheartening, but they speak to an opportunity for us to reimagine what our society might look like. It's bringing to bear a topic that many of us have been talking about for a long time and putting it in the spotlight. So I think now is a really great time to talk about what are some of the strategies that we can use in terms of leadership and allyship to actually change this story. There comes in the gender equity piece, right? So we often use the term gender equality and gender equity to talk about, you know, making advances for women. We sometimes confound the two terms. So what is gender equity? What's the difference between gender equity and gender equality, and why should anyone care? So gender equity, you know, the reason we want to use that term is because we're thinking about, if we look at this picture here, the bicycles, right? And under equality, we can see that everybody's got the same bicycle. And so they're treated as the same, but obviously that bike's not working out for everyone. Right? So gender equality is having equal access to the same resources, opportunities, rights, etc., and being treated as if everybody had the same needs and experience. But we all know that we're different, right? So equity goes a bit further and it says, okay, so we recognize and we celebrate that we're different. My experience as a white cisgendered woman is different than that of a racialized woman without permanent resident status, right? So what would be fair? How do we meet people's needs and help them thrive by giving them what they need in a fair way and allowing them to access their opportunities and rights? A tool that's useful in having this conversation is an intersectional lens. So it's just basically taking into consideration different dimensions of our identities that we bring with us, right? Whether that's our religion, ethnicity, ability, geography, our socioeconomic status, etc. There are many. There's a kaleidoscope there that you can see, but there's probably more than that. And it just talks about the ways that different inequalities operate together and exacerbate each other. That leads us to our next poll. So we're wondering how you feel about decision-making and the inclusion of women's needs, strengths, and lived experiences. Well, that's interesting. It seems like we have quite an even split across the different answers. It looks like 31% of people in our group here think that or agree that women's needs, strengths, and lived experiences reflected in decision-making. So that's good. That's quite positive. And 23% say strongly agree. So then that pushes you up to about half. We also have, you know, a fair chunk of people that think that that's not the case. So I'm wondering if anyone has reflections on these statistics. Does this surprise you? Does this resonate with you?
Caroline, I just wanted to comment that if I was including my community in my answer, I would say disagree. But I selected agree because of my change to the ACAO this year and actually having the chance to influence more inclusive policies. Mm-hmm. So in my particular circumstances right now in the workplace, we have created a very inclusive and supportive policy framework. But if I had to look at the wider picture, I would probably say disagree.
Okay. So there's some nuance there, right? If we just ask in the workplace, it might look different than if we ask just in the home, and everybody has different experiences. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, I think that this conversation is timely because this is really a window of opportunity for us to influence the way that decisions are made, both in the public and private spheres, right? So having conversations with our friends, family, and the people we love, but also with the people in our lives that are leaders, whether they are decision makers, policy makers, in the boardroom, etc. Right? It's kind of a bad news story, but it's also an opportunity to reframe that conversation. So I think that my thinking around this is that we have an opportunity to rewrite the story of inequality. We have a policy window. We have a window where we can say, okay, well, we actually, there's political will to make a lot of change, right? We can do that at the individual level, or we could also do that at the systems level. So this is just a little quote that resonated with me, but the idea around, telling this story and then sort of rewriting the ending is something that I hope we can dive into a little bit more. If we just take a look at this quote, basically, feminism is really feminisms, right? So our different lived experiences, different identities, different intersections mean that we all need different things, right? So there's no one size fits all approach to feminism or to gender equity. It's really about that multiplicity of voices, of needs, of strengths that we need to bring into, leadership and allyship, right? I was weighing back and forth whether or not to include the term feminist here, but I did go forth and include it. And I think when we talk about leadership, there are some qualities, the researchers have, they say their things and they have ideas about what feminist leadership looks like. So this is not the end all be all to leadership and what it means to be a feminist leader or to be a woman in lead, but it's some of my thoughts about what that looks like. So in terms of addressing the disproportionate impacts of COVID and the changed world that we're in, I think that a feminist leadership approach could be useful in some settings. And here are a couple of the components of what that looks like. So it's not an exhaustive list. There are more you can add, take away as you like. Some key things here are the pieces around self-awareness and understanding the position from which we sit and speak, our different identities, intersections. Our ego is a huge one. The culture that we're from, the one that we live in, our privileges. Feminist leadership is also oriented towards, storytelling, sharing, our authentic selves, and how that storytelling can bring us together in ways that maybe more of a quantitative approach might not. It's also oriented towards self-care and caring for others, right? So we see that women are predominantly, responsible for caring. There's a gendered piece, that's a cultural piece. But also if we embrace that and flip it as, okay, it might be a responsibility, but we also own it as a tool for change. We need to take care of ourselves, our needs, our emotional and physical needs, so that we can take care of others. So encouraging other people to take care of themselves too. And feminist leadership is highly relational, right? It's about building relationships with people, and that relationships sit at the heart of leadership. And inclusion, it's a word that a lot of people have different perspectives on. My perspective on it is really about moving beyond tolerating people's differences, both as women or newcomers or of different races, different languages, different socioeconomic backgrounds, etc., to celebrating that difference and accommodating when necessary, but really creating fair opportunity. So it's not about tolerating that people are different. It's about really embracing that. A collective mindset, as well as an interest in sharing power. So this is something that in the work that we do with Collaborative Change Coach, we talk a lot about, which is that everyone is a leader. So affirming our intrinsic or inherent leadership capacity and trusting that we can work together towards a common goal and empower each other to be leaders towards that goal. So it's not necessarily hierarchical. And then another thing that was mentioned during our breakout sessions is, thinking about bias. What are the biases, the unconscious biases that we bring with us because of our education, our culture, our upbringing, dismantling those as much as possible. It's really hard, but we can make an effort. And then demonstrating zero tolerance for discrimination. So when we hear sexism, when we see it at play, whether it's in our home or in our workplace, modeling anti-oppressive behavior and saying that discrimination won't be tolerated. So those are some hallmarks of feminist leadership. I think it leads what Sanella and Dave said, leads us well into allyship and the overlap between what leadership and allyship is. I think, it's not nicely delineated in the sand. They are related, right? So allyship being not so much an identity, but a process of building relationships of trust and consistency and accountability with people that are marginalized or underrepresented. So in this case that we're talking about, women, right? So what are some of the behaviors of an ally? And I think that probably that was discussed in the breakout sessions, some of these other aspects as well. So things that were mentioned were, you know, amplifying the voices of women. Another topic that was mentioned was modeling, which aligns really well with the idea of being a champion or a mentor for someone, a woman, a young woman early in her career, or even, you know, later in her career, or someone from an underrepresented community, and supporting their growth along the way. You know, things like inclusive language, being aware of the way that we speak, how we speak, and not speaking for other people, right? We want to lift people up, not sort of speak for them. I mentioned this before, but calling out unacceptable behavior, discrimination, and sexism. So oftentimes people who are marginalized don't feel comfortable raising those issues, but of course not to the detriment of your own safety. And then also surrounding yourself with a variety of diverse voices and listening, you know, seeking to understand their perspectives, right? And then, you know, the last two topics would really be this idea of putting people on a pedestal for their small tokenistic actions. So being aware that this is a lifelong process and it's not a one-time, you know, one-shot deal. So not giving people special treatment if they do exercise, you know, the, you know, behaviors of an ally. But if they're genuine in their approach, that's great. They should be recognized. But we don't want to reinforce kind of the status quo. And then, you know, last but not least, just seeking information, knowledge, and education, learning about our privileges, learning about stereotypes and biases, and what that means around sexism and gender equity, and checking in with our own assumptions, right? And of course, applying an intersectional lens and how that affects, sorry with the typo there, how that affects our different experiences in life. So a couple very short notes on practical ways to be an ally. I think we are all doing this in our different ways, but I've mentioned mentoring and being a champion, donating to women serving organizations, volunteering, or supporting mutual aid group is a great way to do that right now. And then calling on our leaders and decision makers, of course, to integrate the needs and strengths. So kind of like we said at the beginning of the session, where we maybe in the home feel that we quite equitable. So if you feel that way, great, let's go externally and say to our leaders, what about women's needs when they're making decisions? Let's call on them to step up to the plate and be feminist leaders. We don't necessarily need to call it that, but right now we have a fantastic opportunity to bring that conversation to the forefront, you know, about decision making at all different, in a range of areas, right? So whether that's accommodation for someone in the workplace around caregiving for their children or family, who gets benefit, who gets jobs, who gets promotions, who gets laid off. I think it's all up in the air right now, and it's all an important conversation to be having. And last but not least, a little bit of homework, some food for thought about what you can do to take this forward in your life. So how will you cultivate feminist leadership within yourself and others? And what will you do to be an ally for gender equity in your work and home life?